This presentation will deal with the themes of sacrifice, regeneration and renewal in Sebastian Faulks' novel Birdsong. I'd like to start the presentation by apologising to Jack Masters. This PowerPoint, Jack, is boring even by my standards in terms of its aesthetics. So I apologise for that in advance, but as I've said many times before, hopefully the content is more important than the style. Let's have a look at two quotations here which reveal to us that this is very much a novel about sacrifice. We start the war section of the novel on page 121 with the line, "Jack Firebrace lay 45 feet underground. His back was supported by a wooden cross." And the sacrificial imagery there, the Christ-like imagery, reveals to us immediately that this is a novel about sacrifice, and also that Jack Firebrace is one of the figures of sacrifice in the novel. We get another Christ-like reference when Captain Weir dies. Then it fell like a puppet, its limbs shooting out and the face smashing unprotected into the mud. So we get another symbol of sacrifice when Weir dies. And it's important, I think, that these two men are two of the symbols of sacrifice in the novel because they both represent in some ways the everyman. Certainly Jack Firebrace does. He is the man who has a connection with home, he's the common soldier, he has a connection to the other men. And so it seems appropriate that he, at face value at least, he is the sacrificial figure in the novel. But also Weir is the most sympathetic character in many ways in the novel, so it seems appropriate that he too is sacrificed. I think Weir's moment of sacrifice is as telling as Jack's, because when Weir is sacrificed, he is completely and utterly dehumanized. The pronouns become it rather than his, and he smashes unprotected into the mud. And this seems to be an appropriate sacrifice for Faulks in the novel, because it is also a novel about dehumanization and about men being stripped of everything. That is part of the sacrifice in the novel. And that leads me on to this notion of the destruction of human nature, particularly in the form of the mechanized nature of World War I. And the men are dehumanized by that mechanization, and they become almost a weapon of war themselves. And this is the first, one of the first and most significant sacrifices in the novel, that sacrifice of human nature. Lots of evidence. I've picked out a few here. There are absolutely dozens and dozens of references in the novel. Stephen Raceford says this is an exploration of how far men can be degraded. He also watched the men harden to the mechanical slaughter, and that word mechanical is used over and over again. The mechanized abattoir is a really powerful metaphor to depict the way in which the men are stripped of their humanity. And that is one of the reasons they become so frightening to the people back home. They moved with grim automatic strength. They were frightening to the civilians because they had evolved not into killers but into passive beings whose only aim was to endure. They're stripped of everything, and that is part of the sacrifice in the novel. We also see the sacrifice and destruction of religion. We see it quite powerfully through the character of Horrocks the Padre, who is brought in to comfort the men before they go into battle. He's described here in a white cassock over khaki trousers, bald head gleaming, was standing with beads and prayer book on raised ground like a useless earthbound bird. Absolutely brilliant description of the futility of and the inappropriateness of religion in this world. First of all, we see the blend of his white cassock and khaki trousers. There's something completely incongruous about his outfit. Religion and war do not sit comfortably together. His bald head is gleaming, and he stood on raised ground like a useless earthbound bird. Well, first of all, bald head gleaming and stood on raised ground. He's being made an example of by Faulks here. And then, like a useless earthbound bird, the sacrifice is in the point that religion has lost its purpose in this world. It no longer belongs here. And we see that later on in the battle, because Horrocks pulled the silver cross from his chest and hurled it from him. So even for Horrocks, his religious faith is diminishing here. The old reflex still persisting, he fell to his knees but did not pray, really sums up how futile religion has become here. We see it again through the image of the cathedral in Amiens when Stephen returns. He left the cathedral behind him, its cold Gothic shape fortified by stacked bags of earth. Religion is being propped up in this new and reshaped world. It doesn't belong here anymore. It's interesting that Stephen is able to leave religion behind him, because as we'll see later, Stephen seems to be the character who is able to leave the old world behind and move into some new, reshaped reality. We also see the sacrifice and destruction of religion through Jack Firebrace, perhaps even more strongly through Jack Firebrace, because Jack is the character with the most most enduring faith in the novel. Even when he gets the letter to tell him that his son has died, he says God 3 times. God knew best. God has mercy. To reveal to us that he has a seemingly unerring faith in God. And Faulks sets that up in order to strip it away later in the novel. Jack turned his face away from what he saw, and he felt something dying in him as he turned. Jack knew what had died in him, and this is when he looks at Horrocks. So Jack recognises that loss in faith in Horrocks. And then later on in the novel, this time he had no prayers to offer. And that becomes even clearer when we get to Firebrace's ending. First of all, this is his final scene in the novel when he's underground with Stephen and they get stuck in the tunnel after the explosion. And we see another sacrificial image, Jack Firebrace entombed in his heavy burial place. It seems once again that Firebrace is the sacrificial figure, the Christ-like figure in the novel. But that changes as this chapter develops. There's an acknowledgement from Jack that there was no consideration beyond the body in the darkness of the tunnel. What was done by them with their hands and legs and voices was the boundary of it all. So Jack increasingly becomes a physical rather than a spiritual character in the latter stages of the novel. And we can see there that Jack has almost lost the hope of heaven there. The physicality of his body and the physicality of the earth is all that there is. There is no spiritual eternity for him. And he says then 18 pages later on 472, get me off this cross. He is therefore no longer willing to be the sacrificial figure that was determined for him. He is willing to be a sacrifice. That's different. But he's not willing to be a sacrifice in the old way, the expected way, because things have been reshaped and things have been changed. And he therefore suffers this really physical, probably appropriately physical death. His laughter turned into a cough and then into a spasm. The hacking, rattling sound filled the narrow space, then stopped. Jack let out a long final exhalation as all the breath left him, and his body fell back in the end he had wanted. So he wanted to be a sacrifice, but the way in which he's sacrificed has changed in his mind. It is now less a spiritual sacrifice and more a physical one, and he returns to the earth rather than to heaven. There is a spirituality to his ending, as if there is the hope of renewal. He let out a long final exhalation as all the breath left him, but it's still a physical rather than entirely spiritual ending, because religious faith in its old form no longer exists. And so for Jack, this is a spiritual ending, but in a new sense, for a new and reshaped world. And ironically, it is left to Stephen, almost ironically, but actually also very appropriately, it is left for Stephen Raceford to be the character of redemption and renewal. At the start of the novel, we wouldn't expect that to be the case. He was the character who sought ending. He was obsessed with ending, and he terrified by the prospect of eternity. But it is Stephen who becomes the figure of renewal and redemption in the novel. And it starts on page 185. After Stephen has been caught in the explosion and he is on the point of death, so far that he has been placed with the other dead bodies. But he comes back to life. Stephen Raceford re-inhabited his body cell by cell. And this is the important point. The reason that Stephen can become the figure of redemption and renewal is because he had no sense of being before the war or in his past. He wasn't an established character, no connection with home, no sense of family. He was, to all intents and purposes, an empty vessel. And so he is able to restart from scratch. And that's why Stephen can exist in this new and reshaped world. For the others, it's too much of a detachment from who they were before. Certainly for Jack Firebrace, he is too far detached from where he was before. It's too painful to restart. Stephen doesn't have that, and so he is able to begin again and to renew. We see that I have no home in England. I wouldn't know where to go. And when he goes back home to England, he says, I'm going to, and he doesn't know. He has no sense of belonging. We also see on page 226, in that moment of intense battle, we see Stephen going through some sort of metamorphosis. It's as if war reshapes his character and it gives him the potential to begin again. He was hunched like an old woman in the cocoon of tearing noise. The cocoon is a really powerful metaphor here, because even in the intensity of battle, Stephen is able to find a place where he can find some new sense of himself. He is reshaped and reborn through the acts of warfare. He sees the world as being fresh and restarting rather than being destroyed. He felt alone, as though he had stumbled on this fresh world at the instant of its creation. He's also alone because he's the only character in the novel with the potential to see this new world for what it is, almost as an opportunity. We continue to see that even more powerfully when Stephen returns home on leave, where you could see the tower of the church. These and the forgiving distance of the sky were not separate, but part of one creation, and he too by the repeated tiny pulsing of his blood. First of all, increasingly through this section of the novel, we see Stephen's recognition that the world is as one. The sky, the forgiving distance of the sky were not separate with the land, but part of one creation. And he is connected to that world. And here we get the word pulse come up again in the novel, the tiny pulsing of his blood. But tiny pulsing is significant. It's as if things have only just started for Stephen. He has only just been reborn. And it is at this point that we see the natural motions of the world begin to restart. The sun at last went down and the moon glowed. The certainties of night and day, which had seemed to be gone, the world was not what it should be, have restarted for Stephen. And again here on 437, there were no distinct worlds, only one creation to which he was bound by the beating of his blood. And then on 439 he could feel his heart moving slowly against his ribs, and we can see increasingly that Stephen is coming alive now. The tiny pulsing has become the beating of his blood, and then it increases further to the extent that he could feel his heart moving. So things are restarting. His sense of life is increasing. And then the end, Stephen's ending, reveals to us that yes, he is the figure of sacrifice, but he is also a figure of redemption and renewal. His sacrifice is not ultimate like Firebrace and Weir's was. Because here's the moment he emerges from the tunnel and he finds Levi on page 483. Far beyond thought, the resolution came to him, and he found his arms still raised begin to spread and open. So he becomes a Christ-like figure, but he is resurrected from the earth, unlike Weir and Firebrace, who remain in the mud and buried by the earth. Stephen is the figure of redemption and renewal. And that the sound of the birds changes. They could hear the sound of the birds. A lark was singing in the unharmed air above him. The fear of birds that Stephen suffered earlier in the novel is now gone. Birds represent for Stephen freedom and relentless possibility. He's no longer afraid of that because he sees a reshaped world in which he can now exist. We must also consider the women's role in renewal in this novel, and they have a significant role to play in this sense of renewal. The men are largely a figure of sacrifice, and the women become figures of renewal and hope. Elizabeth plays an important role there. She is, after all, the character who is trying to connect with the past in order to, as she puts it, complete the circle. Again, she had touched the past. It had stopped being history and turned into experience. There's this rather naive assumption on Elizabeth's part that she can reconnect with the past in some way. But I think that it's not really, and Faulks reveals this to us, it's not really renewal and redemption in a connection with the past. It's about continuing the world in a new and reshaped world. The blue line across each was firm and assertive. It was not just positive. It was bursting with life. This is Elizabeth's pregnancy test. It is through the act of childbirth and the maternal, nurturing maternal role that women become the figure of renewal here. It's through the birth of her son that she is able to find a route into the future. Gian says on 431, nothing is beyond redemption. And even Stephen recognises the female role in redemption. On 472 he's talking about Isabel when he says, there was something in what happened between us that maybe made me able to hear other things in the world. That different female perspective provides a route forward. Françoise says of Gian, she nursed him like a mother. She was the heroine of the whole story. In the maternal role, she finds the possibility of renewal. And then we see in the act of childbirth, Elizabeth becomes her most powerful in the novel. Then Elizabeth opened her eyes and he saw them fill with a determination he had never seen in any human face before. She threw back her head and he could see the sinews on her neck rise up like bones. No power on earth could stop the combined force of muscle, instinct and willpower as it drove on to its appointed end. She becomes a force of nature through the act of childbirth. And of course, she calls her son John. So she keeps Jack's line going in a way and fulfills Stephen's promise to Jack, who says he will have children for him. So it is Elizabeth who provides not only the link with the past, but the redemption of that past and its renewal into the future. But of course, ultimately, true renewal is not possible. It's less a renewal and more a restarting of the world, because the world that they knew before is utterly destroyed. Stephen recognises this was the new reality, the world in which they were now condemned to live, and the pattern of the seasons of night and day was gone. The old workings of the world are gone, and they must be restarted and reshaped. He says, I do not know what any of us did to tilt the world into this unnatural orbit. And we see this notion right on the very last page of the novel, when Robert stands in the garden. In the tree above him they disturbed a roosting crow which erupted from its branches with an explosive bang of its wings, its harsh, ambiguous call coming back in long grating waves towards the earth to be heard by those still living. So we see the image of the birds at the end, but look how different that image is from Stephen's acknowledgement of the lark at the end of his section of the novel. This is a crow, the image of death, and it is also one which seems to be incongruous with the world around it. Its wings explosively bang. It has a harsh, ambiguous call which comes in long, grating waves. This is an uncomfortable freedom, if you like. It's not the renewal that everybody hoped for in the aftermath of World War I, because this is a new and different world which will forever be influenced by the events of World War I. So yes, redemption and renewal is possible, but it has to be done in a new sense, and it will always be tainted in some way by the effects and horrors of World War I. I hope that's been a useful look at the idea of sacrifice, redemption and renewal in Birdsong. It doesn't by any means cover everything you might consider, but I hope it gives you a useful starting point.